The water was rising faster than anything Chief Carpenter John Harper had ever seen in 20 years of naval service. December 7th, 1941, had started as a peaceful Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor, but now the USS West Virginia was dying beneath his feet. 7 Japanese torpedoes had ripped through her port side, and the battleship was listing heavily, threatening to capsize like the Oklahoma had done just minutes earlier. Harper stood knee-deep in oily seawater, watching it pour through jagged holes in the hull, and realized that every pump on the ship combined couldn't keep pace with this flooding. They needed a miracle, or they needed something equally impossible, a way to plug holes the size of automobiles with nothing but wood and desperation. Around him, sailors were abandoning ship, following the order to evacuate before the West Virginia rolled over and trapped them all beneath tons of steel. Harper could hear the screams of men still fighting fires on the upper decks, the groan of metal under impossible stress, and the constant thunder of explosions as other ships and battleship rowed took their own mortal wounds. But something in his Carpenter's mind refused to accept that this magnificent ship was finished. Stories of impossible heroism under fire changed the course of history. Stay with us to discover how one man's unconventional thinking saved a battleship that everyone else had written off. Harper's crew had scattered when the general abandoned ship order came through. He couldn't blame them. The West Virginia was clearly doomed, listing 28 degrees to port and sinking by the bow. Any rational person would be climbing over the side right now, swimming for Ford Island before the suction of a capsizing battleship pulled them under. But Harper wasn't thinking rationally. He was thinking like a carpenter facing an impossible problem that demanded an immediate solution. The torpedo holes were massive, each one approximately 20 feet across where the warheads had detonated against the ship's side. Water pressure at this depth was immense, forcing thousands of gallons per minute through each breach. The standard damage control procedures, mattresses, collision mats, shoring timbers, were laughably inadequate for destruction on this scale. Harper needed something different, something that could be shaped and forced into irregular openings, something that would swell when wet to create a tighter seal. His mind raced through the ship's inventory. The West Virginia carried standard damage control supplies, but nothing designed for catastrophic hull breaches of this magnitude. Then Harper remembered something from his years working in shipyards before joining the Navy. He remembered how wooden pegs and plugs were used in traditional shipbuilding, how certain types of wood would expand dramatically when saturated with water, creating watertight seals in smaller gaps and seams. The ship's carpenter shop was on the second deck, already partially flooded but still accessible if he moved quickly. Harper waded through the corridors, the deck tilting at an increasingly severe angle beneath his feet. Equipment and debris floated past him in the murky water. The ship groaned around him, a sound like a living thing in its death throes. He pushed through a damage hatch and into his workshop. The space was chaos. Tools had been thrown from their racks by the torpedo impacts. Workbenches had torn loose from their bolts. But Harper's supply would remain largely intact. Oak planks, pine boards, mahogany pieces intended for furniture repairs, teak components for deck work. He grabbed an axe on the wall and began his mad work. Harper started cutting wood into conical plugs of various sizes, working with frantic speed. His hands moved with the practiced efficiency of a master craftsman, even as water continued rising around his ankles. He didn't have time for precision or perfection. He needed volume, needed dozens of wooden plugs that could be hammered into the ragged edges of torpedo holes. The theory was simple: drive the soft wood plugs into gaps around a breach. Let the water pressure and the wood's natural expansion create a seal, reduce the flooding enough for the pumps to keep pace. It was an insane plan. It violated every principle of naval damage control he had been taught. Wooden plugs couldn't possibly seal holes large enough to drive a truck through. But as Harper worked, cutting and shaping plug after plug, he knew that insane plans were all they had left. The USS West Virginia was going to sink unless someone did something that conventional wisdom said was impossible. Harper loaded his arms with the first batch of wooden plugs and made his way back through the flooding compartments. The list had increased to nearly 30 degrees now, making every step a challenge as he fought against both the angle of the deck and the rushing water. He could hear the damage control party still fighting fires above, but down here in the bowels of the ship, He was alone with his desperate idea and a pile of hand-carved wood. The largest torpedo hole was in the third deck, a gaping wound that had flooded an entire compartment within seconds of impact. Harper waded into water that was now chest-deep, holding his wooden plugs above his head. The opening was even worse up close. Twisted metal edges, jagged steel petals bent inward by the force of the explosion, and water pouring through with the force of a rapids. Any sane man would have turned back. Harper set down his plugs and got to work. He started at the edges of the breach, finding the smaller gaps where the torpedo hole met the ship's internal framework. Using a heavy mallet that he had tied to his belt, Harper began driving wooden plugs into these spaces. The first few attempts were failures. The water pressure simply blew the plugs back out, but Harper adjusted his technique, cutting notches in the plugs so they would catch on the irregular metal edges, wedging them in at angles that let the water pressure help hold them in place rather than push them out. Slowly and possibly, it began to work. The wooden plugs compressed under the mallet blows, their fibers crushing together. Then they swelled as they absorbed water, expanded to fill the gaps more completely. Harper worked methodically around the perimeter of the hole, driving plug after plug into every opening he could reach. The main breach was still pouring water, but the flow around the edges was decreasing. It wasn't much, but it was something. Lieutenant Commander Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the ship's executive officer, had remained aboard to coordinate damage control efforts. He was making his way through flooded compartments when he heard the rhythmic hammering coming from below. Following the sound, he found Harper working alone in the partially flooded space, surrounded by wooden plugs and apparently attempting to stop a torpedo hole with carpentry. Hillenkoetter's first instinct was to order Harper to evacuate immediately. The ship was clearly dying, and one man with an axe and a pile of wood wasn't going to change that. But then he noticed something remarkable. The water level in this compartment had stopped rising. It wasn't dropping, but it had stabilized. Harper's insane method was actually reducing the flooding enough for the ship's pumps to keep pace. The executive officer made a decision that would save the USS West Virginia. Instead of ordering Harper to abandon his efforts, Hillenkoetter sent runners to find every available carpenter, shipfitter, and damage control specialist still aboard. Within 20 minutes, Harper had a crew of 15 men working under his direction, all of them following his unorthodox method of plugging torpedo holes with hand-carved wooden wedges. They worked through the day and into the night, even as fires raged on the upper decks and the battle continued around them. Harper moved from breach to breach, directing his makeshift team, demonstrating his technique, cutting more plugs when they ran low. The men followed his lead without question, perhaps because they were too exhausted and traumatized to argue, or perhaps because they could see with their own eyes that the impossible was actually working. The second torpedo hole presented different challenges. The metal had been blown outward here rather than inward, creating a concave surface that offered few anchoring points for wooden plugs. Harper adapted his approach, using longer wedges that could be driven between the damaged hull plates and the internal frames of the ship. He showed his crew how to stack multiple plugs, creating a lattice of wood that distributed the water pressure across many contact points rather than relying on single pieces of hold. By midnight, they had treated 4 of the 7 major torpedo holes. The West Virginia's list had stabilized at approximately 22 degrees. She was still gravely wounded, but she was no longer in immediate danger of capsizing. The pumps were slowly winning the battle against the flooding, pulling water out faster than it was coming in through Harper's wooden patches. What had seemed like certain doom 12 hours earlier was transforming into a salvage operation. Harper's hands were raw and bleeding from hours of swinging the mallet. His uniform was soaked through with oily seawater, and he had breathed so much smoke and fumes that every breath burned. But he continued working, moving to the 5th torpedo hole, then the 6th. His crew followed him without complaint. These sailors who hours earlier had been abandoning ship, now refusing to leave until the job was finished. Hillenkoetter watched from the damaged command spaces above, coordinating firefighting efforts while keeping track of Harper's progress below. The executive officer knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, not just a technical achievement of plugging massive battle damage with wood, but the human achievement of men refusing to accept defeat even when every rational calculation said their ship was lost. As dawn broke on December 8th, The full scope of the devastation at Pearl Harbor became visible in the harsh morning light. The Arizona was gone, blown apart by a magazine explosion that had killed over 1,000 men in seconds. The Oklahoma lay capsized, her hull exposed like the belly of a dead whale. The California was settling into the mud. But the USS West Virginia, against all probability, was still afloat and nearly level in the water. Harper's team had worked through the entire night, and their exhaustion was absolute. Several men had collapsed from fatigue and had to be carried topside for medical attention. But the seventh and final torpedo hole had been treated with wooden plugs, and the flooding was now fully under control. The ship's pumps were actually lowering the water level in the damaged compartments, something that would have been impossible without Harper's unorthodox damage control method. Captain Mervyn Benyon had been killed during the attack, struck by shrapnel from an explosion on the nearby Tennessee. Hillenkoetter had assumed temporary command, and one of his first official acts was to tour the damaged areas with Harper as his guide. The executive officer needed to see with his own eyes exactly what had been accomplished in the chaotic hours following the attack. They descended into compartments that had been completely flooded 18 hours earlier. The water had been pumped down to ankle depth in most spaces, revealing the full extent of the damage. The torpedo holes were massive, their edges blackened by explosions and twisted into nightmarish shapes. And there, around each breach, were Harper's wooden plugs, hundreds of them, driven into every gap and crack, swollen with seawater into tight seals that were somehow holding back the ocean. Hillenkoetter stood silently for a long moment, studying the impossible repairs. He was an Annapolis graduate, trained in conventional naval engineering and damage control procedures. Nothing in his education had prepared him for the sight of a battleship's torpedo damage being controlled with hand-carved wooden plugs. It shouldn't work according to any theory he knew, and yet it undeniably did work. The West Virginia was proof of that. The executive officer turned to Harper, who stood swaying with exhaustion, his hands wrapped in makeshift bandages. "Chief, what you've done here defies every damage control manual in the Navy. How did you even think to try this?" Harper managed a weary smile. "Sir, I'm a carpenter. When I see holes, I think about how to fill them with wood. Didn't have time to worry about whether the manuals said it would work." Word of Harper's achievement spread rapidly through the devastated Pacific Fleet. Other ships that had sustained damage began requesting his assistance. Harper and his team spent the following days touring damaged vessels, teaching their wooden plug technique to other damage control parties. The method was quickly incorporated into emergency procedures, and carpenters throughout the fleet suddenly found themselves elevated to critical damage control positions. The salvage of Pearl Harbor became one of the great engineering achievements of the war. Over the coming months, the West Virginia would be pumped completely dry, patched with steel plates, and eventually refloated. She would return to service in 1944, completely rebuilt and modernized, participating in the battles of Leyte Gulf and Okinawa. But none of that future salvage work would have been possible if Harper hadn't kept her afloat during those critical first hours after the attack. The Navy's Bureau of Ships conducted an official investigation into Harper's methods, sending engineering officers to Pearl Harbor to document exactly what he had done. They were skeptical at first, these academy-trained engineers who approached problems with mathematics and established procedures. But when they examined the wooden plugs still in place weeks after the attack, when they calculated the water pressure those plugs were withstanding, when they saw the West Virginia floating when she should have capsized, their skepticism transformed into respect. Harper himself was remarkably modest about his achievement. When interviewed by the investigating officers, he insisted he had simply done what any carpenter would do when faced with holes that needed filling. He deflected credit to his crew, to the men who had stayed aboard to help him when they could have saved themselves. He treated the whole thing as if it were merely an interesting problem-solving exercise, rather than an act of desperate improvisation that had saved a battleship. But others recognized the significance of what had happened. Harper received the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his actions, though the award seemed inadequate for someone who had single-handedly prevented the loss of a major capital ship. More importantly, his technique was formalized and added to damage control training throughout the fleet. Future generations of sailors would learn about wooden plugs and emergency hull repairs, techniques that trace their lineage directly back to one carpenter's refusal to accept the impossible. The wooden plugs themselves became legendary. Some were preserved as they were removed during the West Virginia salvage, kept as tangible proof of what desperation and ingenuity could accomplish. Officers would show them to new recruits. These crude pieces of carved wood that had held back the Pacific Ocean and saved a battleship. They looked like nothing special, just wood, swollen and compressed, discolored by oil and seawater. But they represented something far more important than their physical form suggested. The months following Pearl Harbor transformed the Pacific Fleet from a devastated force into a determined war machine focused on recovery and revenge. As salvage operations continued throughout early 1942, the USS West Virginia remained a constant reminder of what human ingenuity could accomplish against overwhelming odds. Harper's wooden plugs held firm through storms, through the constant work of salvage crews cutting through the damaged hull, through the gradual process of pumping out thousands of tons of water and oil. Harper himself continued working aboard the West Virginia throughout the salvage operation. He had been offered reassignment to other duties, even a promotion that would have taken him away from Pearl Harbor, but he refused. The ship had become personal to him in a way that went beyond normal duty. He had fought for her survival when everyone else thought she was lost, and he intended to see her through to the end of the restoration process. The salvage team discovered something remarkable as they worked deeper into the flooded compartments. In several areas where Harper's plugs had been installed, the wood had swollen so completely that it had actually fused with the surrounding metal, creating seals that were stronger than anyone had anticipated. Naval architects studying the phenomenon realized that Harper had accidentally discovered an emergency repair technique that could be applied in situations where conventional methods were impossible. By May 1942, the West Virginia had been pumped completely dry and moved into dry dock for detailed assessment. The damage was staggering when viewed in its entirety. 7 massive torpedo holes, extensive fire damage, twisted frames, and buckled decks. The ship would require complete reconstruction, essentially being rebuilt from the waterline up. But she would be rebuilt, and that was the important thing, without Harper's intervention on December 7th. There would have been nothing left to rebuild. Harper was present when the last of his wooden plugs were finally removed and replaced with proper steel patches. He watched as workers carefully extracted pieces of oak and pine that had been compressed into service far beyond anything their creators had intended. Some of the plugs had been in place for nearly 6 months, subjected to constant water pressure, temperature changes, and the stresses of salvage operations. That they had held at all was remarkable. That they had held well enough to save the ship was nothing short of miraculous. The chief carpenter kept several of the plugs as personal mementos, rough pieces of wood that bore the marks of his chisel and the compression of seawater. He would carry them for the rest of his life. Simple objects that represented the most important work he had ever done. Years later, he would show them to his grandchildren, explaining how sometimes the simple solutions were the most effective, how training and experience mattered less than the willingness to try something when conventional wisdom said all was lost. The rebuilt USS West Virginia rejoined the fleet in September 1944, almost 3 years after the attack that should have destroyed her. She bore little resemblance to the ship that Harper had saved, modernized with new radar systems, anti-aircraft guns, and fire control equipment, rebuilt with knowledge gained from years of naval combat. But deep in her structure, in places where salvage workers had chosen to leave them in place, a few of Harper's wooden plugs remained, incorporated into the rebuilt hull as testimony to the ship's survival. Harper was not aboard when the West Virginia returned to combat. He had been reassigned to training duty, teaching his emergency repair techniques to new generations of damage control specialists. The Navy had recognized that his practical knowledge was too valuable to risk in combat, that his methods needed to be preserved and distributed throughout the fleet. He taught at schools in San Diego and Norfolk, demonstrating his plug-cutting technique, explaining his thinking during those desperate hours at Pearl Harbor. The West Virginia participated in the major naval battles of the war's final year, her guns firing at Leyte Gulf and Okinawa, her crew fighting with the knowledge that they served aboard a ship that had refused to die. The sailors who joined her after the rebuilding heard stories about the carpenter who had saved her with wooden plugs, tales that seemed too incredible to be true until veterans showed them the documentation, the the photographs, the official reports that confirmed every unlikely detail. When the war ended in August 1945, the West Virginia was present in Tokyo Bay for the surrender ceremony. She had survived Pearl Harbor, survived 3 years of Reconstruction, survived combat in the Pacific's most savage naval battles. Her presence at the surrender was symbolic, proof that the fleet that had been devastated on December 7, 1941, had not only survived but had returned to accept Japan's capitulation. Harper retired from the Navy in 1946, returning to civilian life with the satisfaction of knowing his moment of desperate improvisation had contributed, in its own small way, to the eventual victory. He never sought fame or recognition beyond the medal he had already received. When reporters occasionally contacted him for interviews about Pearl Harbor, he always emphasized the same points: the bravery of his crew, the teamwork of the salvage operation, the resilience of the ship herself. But in damage control schools, in naval architecture courses, in the collective memory of the Navy, Harper's achievement lived on. The story of the carpenter who saved a battleship with wooden plugs became legend, taught to every new generation of sailors as an example of thinking beyond conventional solutions, of refusing to accept defeat, of doing the impossible because the alternative was unacceptable. The USS West Virginia had been saved not by sophisticated engineering or cutting-edge technology, but by a craftsman who understood his materials and refused to give up on a ship that everyone else had written off.